right then. Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, this is The Integral Stage. I'm Layman Pascal, and you're tuning into My Kind of Country, a series in which we explore the personal experience of nationhood through a liminal, transformational, developmental, and regenerative lens. What is it like for people with a world-centric or cosmocentric sensibility to be from a country and feel part of a people? What's going on for them as a participant in an intersubjective national identity? What identifies that particular nation field for them? What might the role of nations be in the benevolent future transformation of human civilization? And upon what factors does the viability of a sacred civic spirit depend? Joining me to help explore the so-called lower left dimension of second-tier nationalism is American citizen and guy with two first names, Josh Leonard. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Layman, how are you?
Good, man. How does it feel to be a citizen of the United States right now? What's the vibe?
The vibe. Well, we're all about vibes these days, I suppose. So I guess that is probably the best place to start. The vibe is, a little tough in my neck of the woods. I live in Oakland, California, which is, kind of the heart of the progressive left in many ways. So, the vibe here is pretty despondent, I would say. Not necessarily speaking for myself, although not necessarily not speaking for myself either. I'm sure we'll get into that. So yeah, it's an interesting time to be an American, that's for sure. It's certainly an interesting time to be an American for someone who leans a little bit to the left. And so, I think there's been a kind of wait and see anticipation of the new administration, and I think we've waited a little bit, and now we're seeing some of the early results, and there's some concerning issues. So I think it's a complicated time to answer that question. I'm sure we'll get much more into that.
Yeah. How do you, and nobody has a perfect strategy for this, but how do you think about teasing apart what the current administration is doing just as stunts and what their actual agenda is?
I think that they are, I think they're trying to project a certain kind of change and project a certain kind of confidence and project a certain, degree of power that they are trying to extend. I just listened to a really interesting podcast with Ezra Klein, who was talking about how, the beginning part of any administration is really the only time that they get to sort of control the football. That the first, several weeks of an administration generally is when all the flurry of activity happens. They're controlling the narrative, they're controlling the political action, they're, sort of flooding the zone, so to speak. And then after that, a presidency largely becomes responsive to the conditions of the world, the conditions of the country, the sort of response of the people that are being governed. So a lot of it is sort of meant to be this really flashy show of executive power, and then the rest is sort of up to the universe. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I hadn't really considered it that way. I think it's interesting to see that we're, seeing this flurry of political activity through executive orders, which are, ultimately limited in their durability and will face, court scrutiny, and will, in the very least, be subject to, being reversed by other executive orders from future presidencies. So I think it's meant to be a show of force. It's meant to be a sort of shock and awe. And I think we'll see how things actually settle in as the sort of legal and legislative workings sort of work things out.
I used to be decisively indifferent to Ezra Klein, but lately I found him to be one of the richest leading edge commentators on the American scene. And I don't know if that's because I'm appreciating him more richly or because he's
Right.
grown a little bit in what he's grappling with, but I'm really enjoying him lately.
Yeah, I
Uh,
agree. I think
yeah,
he's a pretty sophisticated thinker, and Yeah, I think he's moved a little bit from his sort of more I don't know, ideological sort of position. I think he's kind of taken on the gravity of being a part of the New York Times with a shrewdness that I found really, really impressive. And I think I'm also really interested to read his new book, Abundance. I forget who his co-author was, but it also sounds like an interesting read. So,
As a Canadian, I spend my life hearing Americans say things about themselves and about America, which I find interesting, but I don't necessarily believe because I have that distance.
yep.
From your point of view, what's true about popular descriptions and invocations of the American spirit, and what's bullshit in what you hear people say about it?
I think there's always a sort of going to be a bullshit layer to what you hear about the American spirit because I don't know if it's just sort of American hubris or American hegemony. There's going to be a certain story that we tell ourselves that's obviously oversimplified and naive, frankly. But I think that there are undercurrents to the American spirit that I personally appreciate. And even in a moment like this, where I feel like that hubris is sort of in its ascendancy, at least in the representatives of our government, I still think there's something to the American spirit that's worth exploring and means something to the world and to history.
And what is that? How would you characterize the viable aspects of the American spirit?
I think it was. I think there's something to being, I mean, this is arguable, of course, but being one of the earliest democracies in the world. And I think, George Packer described it once in just this super simple way that I really loved, which is, a group of people who came to form a nation and to govern their affairs together. And obviously we've come a long way from that spirit, but I do think that sort of independence and that kind of that simple pluralistic approach has been something that's part of that spirit that really resonates with me. Um, I think there's a sort of a flowering of modernity that the United States represents, for better and for worse. I mean, we're certainly seeing some of the worst aspects of it now, but I think there was a time where it really, represented kind of the pinnacle of classical liberal sort of ideals, and that the economic prosperity that it didn't offer everyone equally, certainly, but that it's sort of shown as a beacon for the world and for immigrants everywhere to be able to aspire to, is a really beautiful part of the American spirit. And again, I don't want to gloss over any of the sort of dark side of the American spirit either. There's certainly enough there to dive into. History of slavery and wiping out an entire native population for the most part that were inhabitants of this land. Those are obviously issues that are a part of our history as much as anything else is. But I do think that there is an aspirational spirit to America that is still worth fighting for and still worth trying to hold to as a nation.
I have mixed feelings about the American, but also in general, the sense of national specialness, right?
Yeah.
There's this history of American exceptionalism. There's this remarkable way in which Trump is putting America first in a way that's forcing other nations to put themselves first, like
Yep.
uh, Canada First has never been as strong as it's been in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I bet.
So there's an argument that that's a good thing, that every people, every nation, every country should feel special, prioritize themselves, believe in their magical status, that that's a way of empowering themselves within a community of other nations that are doing likewise. On the other hand, that attitude can be hubristic, tribal, regressive. It can make a country blind to its insufficiencies and, let's say, unable to form alliances based on trust and mutual respect with other nations. When you hear America privileging rhetoric, does it make you feel emotionally encouraged or emotionally wary?
Definitely emotionally wary. I mean, I believe in the power of nations. I think there needs to, even if we were to, approach some sort of idealized sort of global commons, global citizenry, I still think there's going to be a place for nation states. Um, and I and I would say the same thing sort of like fractally. I think, right now, I think one of the healthiest things the United States could do would be return to sort of federalism where the states themselves are competing for citizens within the country, and there's we're able to try out different political governance models and ideals and values in a more local context that could create sort of a way out of some of the polarizing nationalized identity that we're fighting for right now. So I think the same could be said globally, same could be said nationally. So I think there's always going to be a place for that sort of polarity of competition and cooperation that we always have to balance in a healthy way, internationally and internationally. So I think, but I'm certainly wary of the breaking of the alliances. I'm certainly wary of essentially the breaking of Pax Americana that has been that's helped to hold, at least big chunks of the world together in alignment with larger goals. And I think as we, it's such a cliche, but as we look at the challenges that we are facing as a species, as a civilization, so many of them are transnational that the idea that we're going to somehow make any significant progress on those issues by retreating into nationalism in a really extreme way and foregoing the alliances and the cooperation necessary to address some of those issues is, to me, regressive and moving in the wrong direction.
So you were born in the mid 70s. What are some of your first memories of realizing that there was something called America and that you were in it?
I grew up in San Francisco, so to very liberal sort of middle class parents, and so my earliest memories are of like my parents railing against the Reagan administration, and like so much righteous anger in my kind of family community around the what was a 12-year sort of Republican rule. So my earliest memories are of like, oh man, our side never wins. And so it was very tribal in that sense, although we wouldn't have used those terms back then. Um, I do remember, the voting location when I was a kid was literally like 3 houses down. There was just this garage, and they'd have the little kids table where you could vote for. I don't even think they had the current candidates. I think like you could vote for the favorites of classic American presidents there, but you got your little voting sticker, and I remember that sort of. I didn't know any differently, but I remember thinking that was really cool, and it felt very, very close and very local and very participatory. So those were some of my earliest memories of sort of politics. And we didn't do a lot of traveling when I was younger internationally, so I didn't have a much larger sense of sort of what America's place and identity was in the world. So I think for most part, I mean, you know, it was a relatively prosperous time and peaceful time to be an American. And so I think to some degree, I lived in the naive embrace of that sort of view of what my country was and its role politically in the world and that
Right
kind of thing.
in the middle of the Gen X nest.
Yes, exactly.
Well, when you first did travel internationally, what was your sense of what people in other countries were saying and seeing about America?
I sort of had, some early. We took some. My family took a couple of drives up into Canada and Vancouver early on, and I don't remember having any like sort of international experience other than just sort of looking at this beautiful place in the world and seeing what it was like. But we weren't interacting with a lot of people. I didn't really do a lot of international travel until um, till sort of like late 20s, early 30s. And, it, I think the sort of political view of my political view at that time and the way that I felt like I was received or the way that America was perceived internationally when I was doing that traveling depended very much on sort of who the president was. Those were, really the Obama years and the Bush years. And so I think it very much depended on sort of who the president was in terms of the reception that I got. I think, there was a time where Obama was probably more popular internationally than he was even in the United States, and there was a pride I felt in being in other countries during that time. And then during the Bush years, there was this huge backlash to Bush internationally in particular. And so, it was kind of a cliche, but like you wouldn't emphasize your being an American during that time because, there was a lot of resentment around the Iraq War and the way, kind of President Bush was. So yeah, I think, that was general my awareness of it. I remember having a conversation. We were in Greece during campaign, the 2016 campaign, and I remember having a conversation with some fellow travelers about Trump, and it was kind of this like, there's no way he's going to win, right? And I was like, no, I really don't think he's going to win, but we always have to hold out the possibility, and sure enough, he did. So yeah, so it's kind of mixed, I guess. Nothing really stands out necessarily in terms of like my experience of walking through other parts of the world as an American, but I do. I've loved travel in that sense, and I've loved getting a chance to see other parts of the world and other um, lifestyles and political values, and have really come to sort of, through that travel, think of myself as much as a, citizen of the world as I am a citizen of my particular country.
I love this image you presented a few minutes ago about like this childhood kind of early voting training. Where you get a sense of the
Right.
ritual, you get a sense of the accessibility of your participation in the system. As you became an adult, what was the first American election you voted in?
I think I wasn't of voting age. Yeah, I think the first election I voted in was probably the 2000 election. Yeah, yeah, which is the Bush Gore shit show.
And do you voted Gore, I'm assuming?
I voted. Oh no, no, actually, I
No?
voted. Um, oh my God, I'm going to blank on his name. Who was the third party candidate? Um,
Oh, was that
Ralph
Ross?
Nader.
No, Ralph
I
Nader.
voted
Yeah.
Nader.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. As the good UC Santa Cruz college student I was, I had to vote for the more progressive
Was that
candidate at the time.
an obvious choice for you, or did you have to wrestle with that? Maybe this is a spoiler and I'm wasting my vote thing.
I wrestled with it a little bit, but sort of like justified it under the political calculation that I was in California, and Gore was in no risk of losing California.
Um, have you voted for other third-party candidates, or have you voted pretty consistently Democrat since then, or what's
I
your
voted,
voting
yeah, I voted
biography?
pretty consistently Democrat since then, and really got fired up, politically by Obama's candidacy. And I think, to me, that sort of marks the beginning of my little bit deeper interest in politics, partly because of him as a candidate and what appealed to me about him, but also partially because, I was by that point very much into integral philosophy and was starting to read some of the sort of early biodynamics and integral analysis of politics, and it was a really interesting lens for me to use in looking at politics. So that's when my sort of like larger political interests, identity, and integral political analysis sort of was born. And and I think in that time there was like sort of integral politics with this sort of integration. It ended up being sort of a more centrist sort of picture to some degree. And that sensibility, as simple as it I see it now, like really resonated in the candidacy of Obama. So I remember hearing his speech in the 2004 convention, Democratic National Convention, the sort of, it's not a red America or a blue America, it's the United States of America. And that feeling like this very integral message to me at the time. So from that moment, I was like, I want this guy to be president. This is the kind of person I think we need. I think he could, again, this has all become a little bit more complicated, but I think at the time he seemed to me to be a voice who could integrate sort of a progressive sensibility with a conservative sensibility and appeal across a much wider sort of spectrum of political thought. And so in 2008, when he won, I consider that night to be one of my favorite memories and most sort of powerful kind of experiences in life. Like the joy and hope that I felt that night was kind of it was a high water mark in many ways in my life.
I think my impression is that a lot of people who voted Obama and felt that popular groundswell of the American spirit in that moment were later critical and to some degree disillusioned by what went on. And I'm very interested in those movements. I look at myself and I think, I've gone through a lot of different strategies. I've had some very patriotic votes. I've had some very cynical votes. I've had some votes based on just vote for who you love, and other votes I'm like, no, you have to be tactical. Have there been moments for you where you significantly rethought and reconsidered the approach that you'd been taking to how you vote, who you support, things like that? Were there any revolutions for you?
There was a revolution, although I don't know it ultimately was reflected in how I voted or the stance I took in, the thinking that I did around who I voted for. But I think that in particular in my work with the Institute for Cultural Evolution and my sort of subsequent engagement in the larger integral and liminal community, encountering smart people who were informed by these same big pictures that I did and believed very, very different things politically than I did or had different
Mm.
political values than I did was a pretty kind of revolution in my thinking. And I think I had, even before then, I think I intuited that there were some things about progressivism that I didn't ascribe to, right? And which was fairly rare in my circle. And I think exposing myself to those people and those ideas certainly grew my sort of criticism of some of what we see in progressivism. Certainly not all. There's a lot there that I still very much support, but I think I sort of developed a much greater appreciation for a conservative sensibility during that time, and could have conceived of a kind of conservative candidate that I could support over, or a Republican candidate over a liberal Democratic candidate, although that kind of person has not shown up. So my voting patterns have largely stayed the
But
same.
in principle,
In principle, I could envision that. In fact, I think that there's likely, if we're to return to any sort of health politically in our polarized state, I think it will have to come from the Republican side.
that's intriguing to me what you just laid out there, because I had a number of discussions with our friend Steve McIntosh around integral patriotism. And for me, it's got two kinds of meaning. One is like an integral affirmation of patriotism as a national phenomenon. But the other one is the patriotism that emerges within the integral meta second tier kind of a space. And as you feel that more, then when you find people in that space who disagree with you politically, you feel like, well, actually, I kind of feel more strongly connected to you than I do to all the other people who agree with me politically. So I'm open to hearing your counter perspective. And that really
Yep.
expands the diversity of the things we take seriously as political options.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that that actually, to some degree, comes back to one of the things that I would still maintain as a really important aspect of sort of the American spirit is there's a dynamism and an oppositional intelligence that I think occurs in the U.S. system potentially more than in other countries, and for better or for worse, it creates these really dramatic political conditions that give rise to, one moment, you know, someone like Barack Obama become president, and then the next moment, someone like Donald Trump becoming president. I think there's a dynamism there that is brought about by the clash of these values and ideals, and that's kind of built into a two-party system that we have that that is certainly powerful and kind of creates generative conditions for interesting emergences, I guess. What I'll to put it in very,
Okay, yes.
yeah,
Very
systems terms. Yeah.
good euphemism. Uh,
Yes.
did you ever seriously think about going into politics?
I considered it at earlier points, but I ultimately, I'll probably echo Brad Kirshner here in the conversation you guys had, but ultimately the fundraising and the sort of what I feel like being a politician sounds really interesting to me. But running and doing the things that actual day-to-day politicians have to do to be able to enact the change in policies they want to see seemed like not fun, and and would require you to compromise in ways that seem like would be challenging.
I've always been reticent about it myself. I think I could be a better advisor than a candidate, although I think I could be certain versions of me could be a pretty good candidate. But I tend not to think about my own involvement as political, but more civic I think
Hmm.
about Kierkegaard and Socrates in this sense that there's something holy about the local community. And
Yep.
I remember moments in my life where I started to realize that if I was walking down the street and I see a guy working on his car and he looks up and I give him a nod and he nods back, I'm like, that's the polis right there.
Yep. Yep.
So
Yep.
for
Yeah.
for you,
Agreed.
not going into politics, what for you satisfies the civic passion, the participation in the shared spirit of the other citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a 23-year career with the YMCA before I, started working for the Institute for Cultural Evolution and got involved with the sort of um, integral and integrative world. And so for me, that was a fantastic outlet for that kind of civic spirit, that local community-ness, the sort of the ties that bind, helping to strengthen the ties that bind in a community. And I spent 10 years as an executive director of two different YMCA's in San Francisco. And in that role, you're a true community leader. You're building community within your organization in terms of the people who come in as members or program participants. There's lots of community activities that we're leading, and then there's a lot of work you do with other sort of community groups and entities, whether it's business or other community-based organizations or government. I got to know in a lot of ways our local government, city council representatives, things like that. And so that really filled me in that sort of sense of civic spirit way to be a leader in the community, and to bring my integrative sort of voice to the communities that I worked with and led and were trying to build was it was a very implicit part of what I was trying to do in those leadership roles.
What do you think about Trump's second win that you didn't necessarily think when he won the first time?
I mean, there was a way in which the first time sort of felt like this fluke. And, in particular, the fact that he lost the popular vote and sort of snuck in with this really sort of narrow margin of victory in just a few states. It felt like a fluke, and it sort of tied into this now, I think, largely debunked idea that, you know, uh, the demography of the United States was changing so rapidly that, I think there was this sense during the Obama years in particular where like young folks and people of color in the United States were overwhelmingly liberal, progressive, and voting Democratic. And there was this sense that like, there could be this permanent majority as those demographics became larger and larger parts of the voting bloc. And so I had this sense after the first win that like Trump snuck through this very narrow window of demography and was able to win, but that window is not closing. And so the likelihood that, someone like him could win after that was never going to really be a possibility again. And so I think that was largely blown up by, sure, he won the popular vote, not by a lot, but he won the popular vote this time. Still wasn't a large number of votes in these various states that he won by, but, there was a fairly big shift in some of these populations and, identities towards him that really blew up that narrative that like, that there was this coming wave of people who were going to ensure that, a more conservative candidate couldn't be viable. Not that I would consider Trump particularly conservative, but yeah,
Yeah, that's a whole interesting discussion as to who's conservative and who isn't. Um,
yeah.
how do you think about people who like? I don't know how many of them there actually are, but imagine the person who voted Obama twice and then voted Trump. How do you think about that person as a fellow citizen?
Yeah, I was I was always shocked whenever I considered, that shift, and you knew it had to have happened, but then, over the course of time, you got to hear from some of those folks who shifted, and I think that those were in large part um, people who wanted to see massive change, and there was sort of an anti-establishment, like things aren't working for me and for this country, and I want to vote for somebody who's promising large scale change. That's the way that I at least now make sense of that voting block, and I think it's in, the fact that the politics, the political values, the leadership style of those two people were so divergent, can tell you a lot in a lot of sense about at least what the potential swing voter in the United States looks like, and what it is that's driving their voting patterns.
Everybody but Americans, I think, they need leaders who have these two weird sets of capabilities. Like on the one hand, you need effective national managers for restorative restabilization and rapid upgrade of the bureaucratic and physical and informational and economic system in a way that increases fairness and increases the feeling of freedom and improves America's global reputation and enlivens the distribution of wealth and creates viable long range strategies that also are incorporative of adaptive anti fragile approaches for surprises that are coming. So that's all one. You can hardly imagine the person who has those characteristics to
Yeah,
begin with,
exactly. But it's
let
right.
alone also has a set of characteristics that enables them to win elections, given the real sensibilities of the American population and the algorithmic and media situation that we're embedded in. So I can hardly imagine who meets both of those criteria. But let's focus on that second one. From your point of view, who can actually win elections in the United States going forward? If you were looking for the kind of character that could win a federal majority rather than, barely break even and get disrupted by some other factor, what would you be looking for?
I'm actually surprised that we haven't had someone arise who can do that more effectively. Like I think there's like, and this is to speak to your point of like you've imagined yourself as an advisor. Like I can imagine myself as an advisor too. And in fact, when I was working at the Institute for Cultural Evolution, that was in some sense our goal was to find the ear of a politician who was willing to break some of the stereotypes that we've kind of fallen into these two sort of stereotypes, and you could sort of walk through how you might speak to a much broader range of political values in your campaigning and in your governance, and start to win what could be some real majorities, which again we haven't seen really since Obama's first term. I mean, a majority large enough to get past the filibuster, for example, and pass some real legislation. And so it's this sort of like divide and conquer, go for the base strategy. It just seems like such a system trap that I'm surprised there haven't been more real attempts to break out of that system trap. So I can envision someone, a dynamic enough leader, a dynamic enough sort of speaker. They would have to be, they would have to take some part of, it really would be in some sense need to be like a Trump and Obama kind of combination, right? Like I think when you described that first political sensibility, someone who could, evolve the system while maintaining stability and prepare for, future challenges, like that, in my mind, that was sort of Obama's approach. I mean, he was trying to do that in many ways, and of course, he got caught in some of the same sort of political yeah, stable, overly stable political situations where you can't make real change. But nonetheless, I think he sort of represented that first piece. Trump represents that kind of like mold breaking, say what, speak straight to the sort of point, less formal, more, less formal approach. So I think in some sense, I could see a real opportunity for someone combining the best of both of those. And I think they would have to be sort of that common sense, tell it straight, less formal, kind of style that I think Trump has been able to break through using. But I think they could do it in a way that would appeal to a much larger political majority.
I remember watching a YouTube video by a guy called Nerdwriter1 in 2016, maybe 2015, and he did an analysis of a speech by Romney and a speech by Trump. And it was the beginning of me starting to think about Trump as a sort of a resurgent, dark, shamanic figure in the village.
Yeah.
But the analysis of the speech pattern was really interesting. Romney did a classic political organization of his words. Right? Here's a story. It has a beginning and an end. It's very linear. It's very rational. Whereas Trump is speaking in a kind of word cloud that amplifies the valence of certain exciting words. And I thought, oh my God, that's what Marshall McLuhan was saying is the inevitable destiny of the electronic landscape. We're going to be moving out of left brain linear coherence and into a kind of omnidirectional, mood based octopus of communication. Do you think that the forces that oppose the quasi conservative regression that's going on, do you think they adequately appreciate and are capable of functioning in an environment where word clouds rather than arguments are the medium of exchange?
No, I don't think that they are. I don't think that they are capable of doing that. I'm not sure I want them capable of doing that, but I certainly also think that like they're, if more responsible political figures can't figure out how to catch the vibe and ride our current sort of social media algorithm driven political contests that mold has been broken, and I'm not sure how you put Humpty Dumpty back. So I think you're going to, a certain degree, have to play that kind of. You're going to have to play that game, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the left in particular has come to realize that and grapple with that yet.
When I talked to Marianne Williamson on this series, I asked her, what was wrong with Kamala Harris as a candidate and as a campaign. And her sense was basically that she was doomed from the start because, lacking a real primary, she wasn't endorsed by the civic sacredness of the process. On the other hand, I look at it and I think, God, the first couple of weeks after which she was selected to replace Biden, the energy was pretty high. If the election had been right then, maybe she would have won. What's your sense of what was insufficient about Kamala as a candidate, but also about the Kamala campaign?
Yeah, yeah. I have lots of thoughts about this. I will say this: I thought she ran a much better campaign than I would have thought possible, just given the conditions at which she came into the race, and than I would have thought possible seeing her previous sort of performance in, in for example, the primaries in 2020. So I thought she ran a really solid campaign given the cards she was dealt. But those cards that she was dealt were really, really bad cards. I mean, not having a primary. Um, I wanted a primary. I wanted I thought James Carville's idea that you do this kind of, the top eight Democratic candidates go and do a roadshow and do a bunch of town halls, and you have some way of gathering um, of delegates to the convention, gathering input from the people before they go into an open convention and select their candidate. Like, again, it's not as democratic as a primary is, but that ship had sailed, and so I would have loved to have seen that. There were candidates that I thought might have been able to beat Trump if that had happened, and I certainly think that if we had been able to have an open primary and Biden had stepped down when he should have, not stepped down from the presidency, but withdrawn from the candidacy, that we could have had a competitive primary that would have produced, I say we, that the Democratic Party could have had a competitive primary that would have produced a candidate that could have been more competitive with Trump in the end. I think she was too tied to a very unpopular Biden administration. And she wasn't really able to sufficiently distance herself from that. I think that was a mistake on her part. I think she could have done some things to more clearly distance herself from the Biden administration, although I recognize the sort of constraints she was under as his vice president to do that, and it would have looked pretty disingenuous to like strike back a little harder against his administration. So she was in a bind. He put her in a bind. And I thought she ran a fairly solid campaign. And I think she didn't fall for some of the sort of, progressive traps that she could have fallen into that campaign. I think she could have done more to push back against some of her earlier sort of woke and progressive sort of positions. And I think she could have found a relatively easy way to say that as I've been vice president, I've come to see that these are, there's ways of throwing your previous self under the bus that you can do with some level of integrity that doesn't come across as disingenuous. And I think in retrospect, it's now clear he should have done more of that. But I thought she ran a fairly solid campaign. And I think she is I think she was, and likely any Democratic candidate going forward for the next little while is going to be in the unenviable position of trying to sort of try to be progressive and conservative at the same time. Like, because I don't see Trump as an expression of like political conservatism, a mature political conservatism, like that really, and because he has now so dominated Republican politics, I think that leaves like the left to represent both a center right, a center left, and a far left on the political spectrum. And that ends up leaving you feeling, like pretty easy to come across as wishy-washy and maintain the status quo. And, it cuts off kind of the progressive, like we need to change things energy. So it's pretty hard to do that. And so she was in a very unenviable position. I mean, I actually thought that energetically she struck the pretty right tone. I mean, I think that kind of like there was this whole, meme around her joy and her, her vibes. And even though I think that certainly did get kind of caught up and overly projected, I do think it was largely native to her. I mean, I think that sort of happy warrior energy, I thought it was going to be decisive. I thought her happy warrior energy was going to win the election. I was legitimately surprised that Trump won again. So again, while I have some criticism of the way that she ran the campaign, I certainly have a lot of criticism of the position that the Democratic Party and Biden put her in. Um, I thought, I thought she ran a fairly good campaign, and I was surprised.
Hmm. Yeah, she's interesting because I'm interested in the fact that she can be so interesting, and yet she was so interesting when she was a candidate against Biden. I think, like you're saying, she had the difficulty of the challenge. The figure skating move she was trying to pull off was basically
Yep.
unattainable.
Yep. Agreed.
I think that in general, the Democrats have this weird tendency to, first of all, default to bureaucratic seniority rather than public popularity, and also choose a running mate that is competent but not going to be problematic, but also not going to be
Yeah.
exciting,
Yeah.
right? I've long
Yeah.
said that if Hillary Clinton had chosen Bernie or Elizabeth Warren, she would be president.
I would agree.
Um,
Yep.
Likewise, I think that if Kamala had picked Buttigieg, that might have been a 2 or 3% advantage. Not that the guy she picked was problematic. I actually really liked
Yep.
him, and I really liked sort of joy as the vibe, kind of like
Yep.
forget about policy. That was a really good moment. But when something you were saying around, having integrity and trying not to look disingenuous, I hear something that I think is probably problematic in the center left position in the United States, and that Trump is demonstrating you can't, if you are concerned about that, you're holding back and you're not going to win.
Yep. No, that's probably true. That's probably true. But
There's
again,
another
it
thing,
wasn't that long
yeah,
ago that wasn't the recipe for
exactly.
success, right?
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
don't, I like it's really uncertain whether Trump could have won at an earlier phase in American history,
Yeah.
like whether there was this always this weak spot, or whether it's a product of the new global and technological and informational environment.
Yep.
At the beginning of this discussion, though, you were talking about that you have a kind of faith that nation still plays a significant role in the planetization of the human species. And you can make the argument either way. Like you can say, uh, planetary citizenship always comes at the expense of your ethnocentric and national identity. You can also make the argument that there's no way to establish a planetary civilization except through nations being treated as if they were the organs of that entity.
Right.
And my question is, what would it take for you to change your mind on that? Like, what would it take for you? Is there anything you can imagine where you would go, okay, I was wrong. Nations, fuck them. We have to jettison that.
Well, it's you know part of the reason I have such a hard time imagining that is just because it's hard to see where you don't get to a sort of larger governance model, but through the nation state. So it's partially just kind of an integral, like, you know, how would you get from here to there? But if I'm ignoring for the moment the challenges of the sort of transcend and include that it takes to get to a global governance. Um, I guess the question is like, what would get me to change my mind that would be a worthwhile trade for a collective governance? So to give up nationhood is a worthwhile trade for the kind of collective action we could have on these big global problems. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I just have a hard time. I mean, to me, that's the carrot. The carrot of that, of that potential is the ability to deal with these large civilization level challenges that we face. And, a global governance that, um, sort of wipes away national governance, um, at least in its ability to work together on those kind of issues. That to me is the reason why some sort of global governance system be necessary. The challenge I see is just that it ends up, it's so easy for that to become totalitarian. It's so easy for that to wipe out local identities and interests and ways of life. It just sets the incentives up on in a way that I have a hard time seeing not becoming really, really problematic.
My sense, I'm in the uh, American periphery, right? So Canada is somewhere between America and Europe in its sensibilities. And so there's a lot of discussion in that space around like, what the hell's going on here? And the general sensibility that I hear a lot of is that the Americans are, on the one hand, delusional when they pretend like they're the only place that has freedom and elections. And other
Right.
countries, we're like, yeah, well, there's other countries that are way more free and way more safe and way more prosperous than you guys. And then the other critique is you're so self-centered, right? If you watch an American show, you're like, do other countries even get mentioned? Are they aware there's a whole planet?
Right.
And that brings up an interesting discussion, which is how much of the pressures that are forming the internal American discussion and polarization and set of political options are actually coming from the choices and values within the United States, and how much of them are coming from the BRICS nations and multinational corporations and emergent technologies and the global environment and things that you can't solve by taking a side in the American cultural war. Like how unique do you think the American situation is? How endemic is it to America? And how much is it a reflection of something that's happening all over the world and isn't based on what's happening in America?
Yeah, I think it's, in having a few conversations with folks in the sort of, larger integrative world post-election, it's been interesting to me that, and I had a sense of this, so I don't want to sound completely naive that I wasn't aware of this, but I think it's not, some of the things that we're challenged by are not unique to the United States, and some of those pressures and constraints and, you know, regressive tendencies or reactive tendencies are happening in countries, in westernized, in modern countries around the world. So I think to some degree it's happening. And I don't think that I hope it's clear that in no way, by saying that we were one of the earliest, if not the earliest democracies, that we are by far we are not the healthiest democracy by a long ways. And I don't think we're, even the healthiest society by a long ways. I think there are other countries have done a better job in a lot of ways of providing prosperity and freedom and for their constituents. I do think that there's a way in which the diversity of the United States, like there's still sort of enough homogeneity in sort of ethnic makeup and cultural sort of makeup and identity in a lot of other democracies that can't be underestimated in providing for their, like in generating their stability and their lower degree of polarization and higher sort of more functional governance is, I guess, what I would say. So I think to some degree, like the United States is sort of a vanguard of that, and it produces the dynamism, it produces the dysfunction, and it's going to largely be replicated around the world as more and more as immigration, for example, becomes a larger and larger problem. not necessarily problem, but is a condition of nationhood, is just dealing with the influx of people of different ethnicities and different cultural backgrounds, and to be, integrated into one's society. So, some sense, I think we're the vanguard, but I don't think that we're the only place that these sort of things are happening. And yeah, and I think that there are there's a lot of strengths to the way that U.S. democracy is set up and established, and I don't necessarily have this huge problem with the two-party system. I actually think there's some cool and interesting things about it, but I think that the sort of coalition building and compromise that is baked into, say, a parliamentary system produces more functional outcomes for those societies. So I think that there's some pieces that are built into the way that our political order is established that create, certainly now, the kind of inability to actually try new things and improve the sort of civic outcomes for one's country. Not
You
sure if I answered
mentioned
your question there, but
it's good enough for me. um, the thing I really seized on in your answer was the notion of a homogeneity that's spread across the diversity of the people. And that's definitely one of the ways I think about progress and regress in terms of development, which is to say, there always is a balance there. How much homogeneity do you need to make diversity viable?
yeah,
Right. And I think about a system, I think about a moment in the history of Catholicism where they moved Jesus's birthday to Christmas to incorporate a pagan festival. And I'm like, that's pretty flexible and plastic. And there's a confidence in that move that we can absorb this diversity into our structure. And
yeah,
conversely, there's the Nazi move, which is, oh my God, things are too complicated, things are too stressful. Let's start eliminating diversity and roll back to the point where
yep,
where the existing homogeneity covers the diversity we have.
yep,
So there's a dynamic there. When I look at the current American situation, I'm not sure. Obviously, they're in a tension between those moves, whether they're going to produce a homogeneity that enfolds the existing diversity that the liberals have been articulating, or whether they're going to make that pseudo conservative move of simplifying the official diversity back to the point where it seems like a homogeneity covers it. And my question is sort of like, what does it take for the cultural field, for the shared spirit to be healthy enough to feel like it can absorb new diversity rather than feeling weak enough that it feels like it has to minimize diversity?
yeah.
And I'm not sure there's a question there, but that's a feeling that I look at a lot.
Yeah, I think that's certainly what we are wrestling with, and it's hard to imagine at this point in time us ever getting back to that kind of strong sense of unity that is willing, that feels that feels like abundant enough to be willing to now, like,
That's right. And when was
welcome
that?
into the
When was
huddle.
America great, Josh?
I'm not going to answer that question. It's a dangerous one, but so I think that, I mean, I think we would have to. I think I think the healthiest thing I can say is, like, to create a true, like, healthy unity and diversity. One has to take, or by one, in this case, I mean, any sort of polity, but, like, has to take pride in its diversity. It had, like, the unity is created through pride in the pluralism
Mm.
that your country has been able to build and sustain and to channel into collective, constructive collective action. Um, that's the only way I think that you get that really, really vibrant, healthy unity and diversity. And I think that there have been times where I think the United States has sort of embraced that. It's hard to see how we would get back to that. Um, but I do think again that like, kind of moving back to a more federated model where there's competition, healthy competition between different political values and different political identities and ideals, is probably the only way that I could see us getting back to that at a certain point, is recognizing that sort of rises all boats, and then a country that can hold, this degree of different political viewpoints and values is itself a valuable thing. So yeah, I think that's how I think you might maintain or rebuild some kind of a spirit like that.
Okay, here's a question I find I've been asking a lot of people on this series, which is uh, the question about like what's inhibiting the existing national spirit from successfully making that move, given the current circumstances of the world. And it's multiple choice, but of course the answer is all three in some version. And the choices are: um, have we insufficiently processed the past? Right? You go, well, slavery, the Indians, like, is America's collective spirit suffering from the fact that it hasn't incorporated, addressed these integrity breaches from its own past?
Yep.
Is it mainly suffering actually from the fact that there are incentivized parties who get paid for the destruction of the social fabric?
Yep.
Or is it fundamentally a question of not having the institutions that produce civic spirit, that we don't have the practices that we need in order to build up that sensibility to the point where it can handle this? Which
Yep.
of those three is it, given that it's all three?
Yeah, of course it's all three. And if I had to pick the most destructive of those, I would probably pick the middle one. I think it's hard to underestimate the influence that our fractured and, as you say, disincentivized media environment has changed the game. Yeah, and I was talking with Bruce about this recently after we published the IAM published his most recent white paper on sort of the algorithmic undertow and the influence of our sort of fractured sense making that's come about because of social media and the perverse incentives of the of those companies. So there is. Speaking of when was America great again? I mean, it's easy to see the power of having limited news and media channels in presenting the country's story to itself, reflecting it back to itself, and telling a coherent story of what the country is and what its values are. And it's hard to underestimate how powerful that can be as a force. And we now, when we look at the effect of the internet and the effect of social media and the effect that's had on our discourse and our political identities and our polarization and our reality tunnels and all of that, it's very easy to say, well, it's too bad we can't go back to a previous sort of media era. And I think that there was there's something that we would certainly lose by going back to that. And even if it's not that we could, but like, let's just imagine for the sake of argument that we could go back to that, there would something be lost in the fact that a huge amount of news and information and, identities and all of that was filtered out by that sort of media system. And so, how do you, I almost imagine, if I imagine some sort of, alien race or something like that, trying to travel their evolutionary path. I have a hard time imagining that the kind of like both the technological age we're in terms of our own weapons of mass destruction and capability of influencing the planet at a planetary scale with our, with our emissions and things like that. Like that certainly is a crucible that any civilization likely has to go through. But I also think that exposure, that the internet and the sort of like connecting all the minds in a particular society to some degree, is also an inevitable, like, is an inevitable condition that civilizations have to learn how to manage, and to some degree, like it can't be managed in a centralized way. It literally has to come down to individuals learning to do better sense making when exposed to the infinite cornucopia of knowledge and information. And so I think we're in a really dangerous period where we have these sort of society, if not ending, certainly like, very, very powerful forces that we have to figure out how we're going to manage them on a societal level and technology and all that stuff. And we also have the sense-making crisis that we're in as a result of this exposure to all the different perspectives in the world at once. And the natural tendency when exposed to points of view that you were never exposed to before and that are different than your own values and viewpoints and ideals and view of the world and all that, is you really only have a couple choices. You either learn to step back and see it in its totality and use big pictures to make sense of it all, and to sort of like not, to learn to see the relative truth in what's going on in each of those, but also like not to lose sight of the big picture. So that is a very rare response, and that is what I feel like in this community, that is our responsibility to sort of present that as an option to to humanity, because the much more likely response to being presented with views that are outside of your own is to retract back to your own views and rally and defend it at any and all costs, and to unconsciously select for and have selected for you, ideas that reinforce your own worldview in the face of that onslaught. So I think that is, while I really would love to do something about the other two that you mentioned, to me, that's the biggest problem, and one if we can't solve, we're not going to be able to rally to address the kind of crises that we're going to be facing.
That problem in particular seems like one that a strong nation state could be leveraged to help with. And one of the examples of that is, the way that China asserts itself as a nation relative to markets of various kinds that are incentivized to parasitize it. Okay, here's an interesting question. What is China doing that you wish America was doing? And what is China doing that you hope America never does?
I went to Shanghai in 2019 as part of an international YMCA sort of conference. And I was sort of struck by, first of all, I didn't see a single homeless person anywhere in China. And, if you, I don't know what it's like in where you live, but in Oakland, like, homelessness is just this huge problem. And it's not one that there are any really good solutions on the table for, as far as I can see. And I didn't see any homeless folks in China, but what I saw was, it looked to me like one relatively poor guy, kind of usually an older guy, who was assigned to clean up his block. And you would walk from block to block, and you would see the guy who was responsible for cleaning up that block. And I'm not a big fan of centralized centralized governments that you know control the economies to such a degree. I think there is something to government's role in assigning a value to collective goods that the market itself won't select for and won't put a value to. That is in many ways probably government's biggest role. I think there are overly centralized ways of doing that destroy the market economic systems and don't create the kind of value creating power that free markets have solved for and generate lots of great, lots of value, not just wealth, but value in the world. But there is something to be said for like putting a value on the public good such that we're going to pay this individual to maintain the cleanliness and the sense of order and the sort of pride of location that that government has done. So that's a pretty small example, but it's something that struck me when I was there, and I thought was very very cool, and something we certainly don't have here. As for what I wouldn't do, while I can see, as I said, the value and the temptation in going back to sort of mono-media world where you're not exposed to all the different perspectives and depravities of the human condition. I think ultimately it's unsustainable to try and hold on to that world through control of the media and through control of information and through control of your citizens' access to different perspectives and ways of life. I think ultimately it's not just undemocratic. It's against the natural evolutionary patterns of life. And so I think that is the piece that I would hope that we would never stoop to in order to try and put the genie back in the box. We're back in the bottle.
There's something I like about the double nature of the last question I asked, so I feel like I'm going to ask a couple more questions like that. What do your liberal friends most misunderstand about America, and what do your conservative friends most misunderstand about America?
I like that question. Let me start with liberal friends. I think, ironically, because most of my liberal or progressive friends, are very much value the diversity side of things, and very much want to champion the marginalized in history and in current society, which is, of course, is incredibly valuable and important, and certainly a political value that I share as well. What I would say, though, is that to see the United States for all of its disasters and none of its dignities is the biggest mistake that progressives make. And to quote our friend Steve McIntosh, to see the entire history of the United States as a largely criminal enterprise designed to exploit people and planet is a very shallow reading of the history of this country, and it doesn't give any credit to the you know the actual sort of march of progress that it takes to build the kind of country that the United States has in its in its brightest days been. And it really is in some ways. I mean, we're kind of getting down to the theme of this conversation and all of these conversations you've been doing for the series, which is like patriotism. Like if you miss patriotism, if you lack patriotism, if you lack the sense that you are a part of a country and you are responsible for helping to make it the healthiest, most um yeah a place where people can thrive and that can become a beacon of hope in the world. Like, you really are missing something about what makes society improve, what makes progress possible, that progressives are so adamantly champion. You kind of miss that spirit, and it causes a lot of cynicism, and it causes a lot of sort of anti institutional fervor that are oftentimes the sort of backbone of that kind of society, that create the kind of opportunity that you so want. So I guess that's what I would say to my liberal friends. Seems a little watered down, but um, what do conservatives miss about America? I think it's that idea that our pluralism and our diversity is our strength. It it's kind of like saying, I mean, in some ways, it's like saying progressives miss the power of the unity, and conservatives miss the power of the diversity, and I think that's largely true. I think there are occasional conservatives, and I'm not even sure they would consider themselves conservative any longer, but I think of like a David Brooks as a person who just really like gets and believes in and loves that sort of like churning, restless diversity of America that I just find to be missing from most kind of conservative outlooks. And while I think there's a lot of aspects of DEI that have gone too far and are not healthy, I think that the kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater that we're seeing right now, as a backlash to that, is equally problematic. And yeah, I think that's probably the simplest way I could put it.
Nice. So I'm thinking about what it takes for people to feel like they are incorporated within a national spirit to the point that they feel active as participatory agents in that field. And I'm going to ask a question that I think is harder than the previous questions and maybe induces some reluctance, which is, what do what do American women need in order to feel like they're really embraced as a part of the shared social fabric and empowered in a way that's worth sacrificing things? And what do American men need in order to feel that?
I think one of the interesting things about uh, Kamala Harris's candidacy, and I don't know if this was intentional or it just ended up being the case, but I felt like her status as a woman was a relatively unspoken and seemed lower on by almost any metric, by in terms of attacks on her from the right and sort of projections of her from the left. I feel like it just was not a huge issue. Um, and again, it's hard to know what exactly to ascribe that to. I mean, maybe it was just a counter reaction to the fact that that was made to be such a big thing when Hillary Clinton was running for president, that like it was recognized as not politically viable to constantly sort of emphasize the fact this would be the first woman president in the United States. So, maybe it was just a political calculation, but nonetheless, it's sort of interesting to me. And we're, it's such an interesting sort of American society is in such an interesting place in that we've got this sort of like, when you look at the number of college students, for example, who are women, and the rising kind of the rising economic status of women around the world. I think there's a strong case to be made for that we are seeing an ascendant sort of version of femininity that is that's going to be taking larger and larger reins of American society. So I don't know. I guess what I would just say is like it seems to me that this idea. I'm sure if this exactly answers your question, but I'm noticing this like on the right, there's this kind of backlash, and you're seeing Mark Zuckerberg say that he feels like companies they've become too feminized and they need to start embracing masculine energy. And certainly the federal government is under the Trump administration is projecting that same sort of thing. So I don't know. I guess I see us sort of struggling with to use David Data's kind of 3-stage model for psychosexual identity and awareness, that like there's a backlash right now to the second stage of kind of like equality and sort of minimizing of the polarity differences between what one would consider masculine and feminine approaches to something. So there's a backlash to that, and certainly, I mean, you can see the rise in sort of the trad wife sort of lifestyle, to see that there's this return to a sort of first stage version of that, and I think that's an interesting experiment. I think it's ultimately a dead end, but it's a fine experiment for society to run. I guess what I would just say is like I think we have largely not filled in any sort of collective vibe-based way what a third stage sort of masculine and feminine approach would look like at a larger national or sociological level. Like it's just completely uncharted territory, and there's really two versions on offer. And so I guess it would, to me, I would say that like I would like to see a call from both sides of the sort of political aisle for transcending this sort of oversimplified dichotomy and re-embracing some more positive, aspirational, evolutionary approach to psychosexual identity and expression.
Okay, that's a pretty good answer, and I'm impressed by the number of different kinds of things you casually fold into an answer. But there's a certain professionalism to the way you express yourself, which is not necessarily problematic. Some of it is just being an integralite and holding a lot of perspectives. Some of it's
Right.
the cognitive capacity you have, but some of it is a kind of professional formativity at a certain level. And you wonder, the listener, I'm sure, wonders, like, how much of Josh are we really hearing in terms of like what he would tell his friends, and how much is he in a perpetual job interview? But I guess my a final question is something like this. When was the last time you felt deeply, authentically, non-performatively patriotic?
So my close circle is very very progressive, and in that sense very kind of like anti-American sensibility, even if not expressed thus, what kind of comes across. My wife's family is is much more conservative, and so we often go down for Fourth of July to Newport Beach, and we do Fourth of July at Newport Beach, and Newport Beach is like this little red island in the the southern coast of California. That, like, I mean, we'd be out on the water on a boat, and you just passing by boats with Trump flags and American flag. I mean, everybody's dressed in head to toe in their sort of American like, colors and clothes. And I remember this was several years ago. It was during the Trump administration, and it was right after George Packer's book. I think Last Great Hope or something like that is what it was called. Book came out, and I was reading George Packer's book, and I was reading the end of George Packer's book where he makes this sort of, he talks about the four different Americas, and then he makes this kind of appeal to this pluralistic unity, like, appeal to that kind of patriotism again from all of these different four different Americas. And I remember it really resonated with me. And I'm sitting in Newport Beach as I finish this book up and watching boats pass by with American flags all over them. And there was like there was a real patriotic sort of swell in me. And it wasn't the sort of like, it wasn't synonymous with the kind of like, I feel like, unreflexive patriotism that I was seeing in some of the people around me. But it was this idea that, we live in a country that can hold all of these different viewpoints and somehow maintain some sense of national coherence around an idea of what America is and could become. And so I really was kind of swept up in it. And I think that there is something, I kind of take a last refuge patriotically in this sort of like dynamism and just restlessness of the American spirit that I think is really beautiful. I mean, I remember traveling to Spain and feeling like, life, in Spain where we were in Barcelona, and people were out having dinner and having large amounts of red wine at like 10:30 at night. And I remember thinking, like, these folks, like, they work to live. They don't live to work in the way that we do in the United States. And there was a part of me that was just very it seemed very beautiful. And I was like, God, I would love to live in a country like this where you didn't have to identify yourself so much with what you were doing with your work and what you were striving to achieve or become or create or whatever. But there's also a way in which I've come to sort of also love that restless spirit that makes America like such a dynamic, but also, oftentimes fractured and polarized sort of place. But at least in that moment, I really felt the kind of like, I gotta love a country that can hold, this reality and where I live, and still somehow hold together. So yeah, I think that was the moment I felt most patriotic in the last several years.